Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Zoe Burkholder. I am a professor in the Department of Educational Foundations, and I'm one of the co-coordinators for our talk series this semester in the College for Education and Engaged Learning. This is our Critical Scholarship at SEAL lecture series. I am very pleased this morning to introduce Professor Jesse Ha in the Department of Teaching and Learning, where he is an assistant professor. And he has a very dynamic and interactive and engaging lecture for us this morning. So whether you are at home or here in the room with us, please use your phone to grab the QR code on the screen in front of you, and that will give you access to today's interactive features. I don't have Professor Ha's bio in front of me, so he has kindly agreed to introduce himself. Please join me in welcoming Jesse Ha. Yeah.
All flaps, okay. So first of all, I want to start before my intro, I want to say, Zoe made it clear to me that this was meant, I have to try to popularize this event a little bit. So make it a little bit, tiny bit less full academic, but, a little bit more accessible for y'all. My name is Jesse. I'm an assistant professor in teaching and learning, like Zoe said. And a lot of my research focuses on learning and cognitive sciences on top of STEM education and computer science, computational thinking, and so forth. I'm also quite a dabbler. I wouldn't say dabbler. I'd say not even dilettante. Somewhere kind of intermediate level with with technology, I guess I would say. And so one of these features that I put up here is something that I found recently that I thought was cool. It's not the best because I don't like making people go to different things, but I just thought that one of its features was quite good. And if you go to the QR code, you have to log in. Unfortunately, you have to log into your Montclair email. Or whatever, if you have Microsoft access elsewhere. But what it will do is it'll give you a closed caption text with the slides on your phone. And also it gives you on the bottom left the option to choose language. And actually I'm watching myself talking Korean. So it's kind of cool. So you can change that. Okay. So I just wanted to give that accessibility feature for anyone who is interested. So I'm going to move on to the slides soon. So those who have not yet done the QR code, I'll give you about 5 seconds and we'll move on. I'll give you 7. Take 5 seconds. Take out French.
So language translation is very good.
It's good. Yeah, French is good. That's good. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, even like ChatGPT, for example, like it wasn't very good at translating Korean. It was quite poor at it, but now it's phenomenal. It's yeah. Anyways, all right. So making active learning a reality, right? And I put it in quotation marks, active learning, for a reason. And because we're actually going to be breaking down active learning with what we call the ICAP framework. And that's, so one of my dissertation advisors, her name is Dr. Mickey Chi, or Michelene T. Chi. If you don't know of her, she's quite formidable. She won the McGraw Prize recently and also the Rumelhoff Prize 2 times in a row. And so she actually just received the Yidan Prize for $7 point something million to work on what we're going to talk about today. And she's at ASU. Okay, so let's start with kind of the obvious. In terms of learning, one of the first things when I ask a teacher, what learning frameworks have you been exposed to, or do you use, or you think about? And a lot of them say Bloom's taxonomy. And so Bloom's taxonomy, a lot of people don't know that it was originally constructed in 1956. And the purpose of this taxonomy was actually not for research. Although a researcher was working on this, it was not meant for research, and it wasn't based on empirical evidence of whether these 6 categories are true or not. I'm not saying that says anything about it now, but I'll just take you through the history, okay? So I think you'd be interested because you hear about this all the time, but you probably don't hear about the history. So Bloom was actually tasked by the Chicago public school system to kind of learn to create a way to create assessments efficiently in the school systems. And so this Bloom's taxonomy that he created was really, these are constructs that were created to be able to create good test questions. So the main purpose of Bloom's taxonomy was primarily assessment creation. And it wasn't necessarily even based on empirical evidence, although future work has done stuff to validate these kinds of efforts. I just want to put that out there, okay? And so we have create, evaluate, analyze, apply, understand, remember. And I know that, or create as in synthesize. I think one of them wasn't there originally, right? And then it was updated, I think by his successors, Anderson Crothwell, was it? 91, I think, sometime around there. Don't quote me on that. But now I want to introduce you actually what many in the learning sciences community is saying is going to replace Bloom's taxonomy. So I want to give you a heads up, but one thing is that in the learning science space, people know this framework quite well, the interactive, constructive, active, passive. But it's still not well known, even in other reaches of the education circles, and especially practitioners have no idea. The only ones who know are the ones who have taught. Or just probably more than that, but I'm probably one of the main contributors to those who know. And so it's not Bloom's, but it's a framework to create a hierarchy for how people can engage in learning. And since Dr. Michelene T has been in learning sciences for decades, and she's quite she's done a lot of the work is also based on her previous work, but a whole corpus of literature is that she took like hundreds and hundreds of articles and she kind of figured that, oh, she saw patterns of learning and engagement, and this is the framework that was created out of it. And then I applied it for my dissertation to college chemistry course design, just to make it a little higher connection. And so to introduce it, it's a hierarchy. So it starts passive is supposed to be quote unquote the lowest, which I will disagree with, and and Mickey's okay with this disagreement, so we'll talk about that in a bit. And then active, constructive, and interactive. So interactive being, I guess, most predictive of deep cognitive engagement for students. And it's a nested hierarchy, which to explain what a nested hierarchy means is that it builds upon each other. So you can't have active without passive. You can't have constructive without active. You can't have interactive without constructive. They kind of build upon each other. And so passive is, actually it's commensurate. So passive and attending, those are related. Active and manipulation is related. Constructive generation and interactive collaboration. And we're going to kind of stack these four things, these four cognitive tasks, and talk about how it might promote deeper learning. So some considerations for the ICAP, because we know of passive and active, right? We've heard of that often, right? One of the things that we need to think about is that passive is not disengagement. So disengagement is outside of this entire framework. So if students are disengaged, and there's a lot of other issues we could talk about, like cultural responsiveness and so forth, of like getting a student involved. This framework doesn't even apply if you can't get them into the space of wanting to learn, right? Of wanting to even passive pay attention to this lecture. If they're not paying attention, then there's no cognitive engagement, right? So active, one other thing is that active is no generation. Let me explain the word generation the way it's defined by this framework is that generation is the creation of a new idea or a connection of ideas and thoughts. It does not mean you're creating something novel for the world, like a new physics like concept. It's new to you. So from a constructivist perspective, for you, if you're tackling with something in a way that you haven't really seen or have a model for, then you're being what we call generative, and you're creating your own versions of things. Okay. Interactive, another part of interact that's really important to talk about is that when we talk about collaboration, even in the collab, so I have a paper on ICAP and cooperative learning right now in the ARA SIG. So this is a little plug. Come in April and take a look. But cooperation and collaboration, although they've been kind of changing the language of which one is which, it's very difficult. And the thing is, a lot of times I'll personally say from my own experience too, is that there's a lot of transactional costs, social transactional costs that can make it even feel more inefficient. Yet a lot of studies actually still showed interactive to be quite robust for cognitive engagement. And interactive, when we say collaboration, we mean equitable co-generation. So one of the things that a lot of students do that I've seen in my classes too, is I give them a complex project and they're like, I'm gonna take this part, you take that part, and we'll just kind of jigsaw it together, right? Or jigsaw learning. You become a master of this, you become a master of that, and you explain to each other, right? Although that explaining part is good, the overall activity fails to achieve interactive because one of the stipulations of interactive mode are that you need to be co-generating everything together, if that makes sense. or at least you don't have to do all the work, but at least the thought creation, at least especially brainstorming portions, right? You should all be involved, right? And yeah, so if it's not co-generative, not equitable, it's just active. Okay. All right. So this infographic, it's kind of smaller, but hopefully you can see it. But this is one I created. Actually, this is for a paper, for a museum paper. So you might see at the bottom like a tour guide. But it's just I like this because it kind of shows it. It's like kind of moving up, slightly nested. I didn't want to make it circles because it kind of, I don't like the design of that. But some examples just to give you straight up passive. We know a lot of what you're doing right now is passive, but I would also argue that it might be constructive. We'll get to that. But most likely passive, right? Reading a text, watch a video. So active mode, we have manipulating an exhibit, pressing a button. I say if you're doing a lab, pouring things, measuring things, moving around, right? Speaking is an active thing, right? But if you're speaking something off the top of your head and you're improvising, that's constructive because you're generating something completely new. But if you're reading off a script, then that's active because you're no longer generating on the spot. It could have been constructive when you were writing the script, but while you're doing the action, it's something that's prepared and right in front of you. And then find interactive things like debating. You know, I always tell my parents that I consult for their kids now. You know, I say, have your kids do Model UN. It's just so good, like things like that, because it's just naturally you just learn so much through each other socially. Okay, so I'm gonna just show you a couple lists of, I guess, different activities. We actually have a entry in the Encyclopedia for Learning Sciences, and there's 50. So I'm not gonna go through all of them, but reading, listening. Oh, one just turn-taking meeting, passive, because although you're speaking out loud, if you think about it, if you take the aggregate time, how much one person spends actually speaking versus the entire group, it's actually quite a small percentage, right? Unless the group is like just 2 or 3 people, then maybe that's a more significant percentage. But most classrooms, I'd say probably 12 to 30 students, right? Or even 40 some classes. And so turn-taking reading is considered passive. Some active ones that you're all more familiar with, like clickers and polling. Do we even use clickers anymore? I use polling. I use the poll everywhere, but clickers, copying, matching, ranking. Although I do like ranking tasks, if you don't ask them to explain, then just the ranking itself is actually active because you don't know if they're actually generating something new while ranking. Rehearsing, fill in the blank, step-by-step instructionals, right? And I think a lot of the active learning that we think about is at this level. And before I move on to constructive interactive, let me explain why we have 3 things for active learning. So active is broken down in this framework into active, constructive, and interactive as a means to kind of differentiate the depth of cognitive load and the cognitive engagement, right? And so here, active is actually considered the lowest form of active learning. So I'm just trying to change your mindset on what the language means. So now when you think of active learning, you think of this, okay? Okay, I want to just show this example. So when I used to teach, I like to give strategies to students or have them eventually develop their own strategies for understanding something. And something as simple as these 4 things. So, 1 second, let me mute this. Okay, so don't call this phone number, please. I don't know where it's gonna go to anymore, but it used to be my phone number when I was like 5 years old. And you know, I'm a Gen Yer, so this was 1991. Pre-cell phones, pre-storage of phones. You had to memorize your phone numbers because if you didn't know your phone number and you didn't know where you were, good luck, right? And so I remember it was impressed upon me that I had to memorize this, but I hated memorizing things. But good thing I liked numbers. I was really a number guy my whole life. Number Muncher is one of my favorite games growing up. Also, they made me do Kumon. I hated that, but it made me comfortable with numbers. And so I was like, as a kid, I was like, how am I gonna remember this 10-digit number, right? And sometimes to a 5-year-old, that could be quite a lot, right? Adults can sometimes struggle with this. So then I made my own strategy in my head. So I said, 7 plus 1 is 8, 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 plus 8, and then just 0, just add on to that then. And it's just like my own mental strategy. And that's me elaborating my own version of how to understand just this phone number. And that turned it from most people, that I know will just kind of just repeat it over and over in the head that I've met. I didn't know that that was what most people did, but they just repeat it over and over to kind of get familiarized and remember it. That's active, whereas this is constructive. And what's funny is that most people don't remember their phone numbers from when they were 5, but I still do because it was so engaging cognitively for me. So maybe that says something. So then let's talk about like vocabulary. So there's words like indelible, ineffable. And I remember I was trying to get a student to understand the word ineffable because I used to teach SAT in Korea. And so I was like, okay, well, we can break down the words to begin with, in, F, and able. And so I was able to quickly say, oh, well, the prefix in is not, and able is about ability, it's the noun form for ability, right? And then F, and then some students said it's fail, F. But I was just like, the way I would describe it is you're not able to effectively express, right? That's the way I would describe this word. The feeling when you can't really say something because you're just so overwhelmed by not understanding even your own emotions, right? And so that's like also its own strategy that is more than active now, because a flashcard where you just look at ineffable definition, different. If you get students to be like, hey, create your own strategies around how to remember this, sure. So oh hell is not English, it's actually Hebrew. So I did learn ancient Hebrew at some point. And I had to also memorize this word. I was like, oh hell, how am I going to memorize this word? By the way, it means tent. So I was like, oh hell, I have to sleep in the tent tonight. So that's how I remember this word. This is a Korean word, 최근에. And I was actually quite bad at Korean when I went to Korea in 2008. I was worse than most people who took introductory Korean and went to Korea. But I was studying Korean because I wanted to be able to, speak the language quite well. And so, but this one word, although for average Korean person, it's a very easy word. To me, I just couldn't get it to stick. Because I was using all these other strategies, but this one, I couldn't even find a way to kind of break this down very easily. So then I actually ended up connecting it differently. At the time when I was learning this word, the president who was actually incarcerated, you could look her up, Park Geun-hye, she was actually at the time campaigning. And so she was in the media, and this word means recently. So I said, 최근에 Park Geun-hye. It kind of rhymes, and then finally it stuck. And I was like, oh, now I know this word. But I couldn't stick. I bet I'll remember this word even if I get like some memory loss in the future. I don't know. Maybe we'll see. But then now moving along, we have constructive and interactive. So constructive, I just showed you a bunch of constructive tasks that are generative, but there's also including analogies, critiquing, explanation, elaboration is a lot of what we did. But then if you take a look here, taking notes in your own words or paraphrasing, quite different than taking notes directly, right? Project and problem-based learning. Actually, yeah, and I'll put that also in interactive, but we put it in constructive because we can't assume that teachers are able to create environments that are co-generative and co-equitable. But if you look at interactive, that's what we're trying to get at. So like asking and answering each other's questions, asking each other for justifications and explanations, debating, peer tutoring, and so forth. And so some considerations for the ICAP. Assessments need to be rigorous because most assessments are at this level. They're asking you to identify things, not generate things, recall, right? But then we need to have assessments. And the reason is that if you don't have an assessment that has more generative kinds of problems in it, then how do you know whether they're even learning deeply to begin with, right? And also, if I want to research you, then I need to know distinction. But it's really important to understand whether it's rigorous or not, right? And so it's really hard to measure ICAP. Let's say if as a researcher you wanted to use this framework in your own work, you need to make sure the assessments are good. Another thing is that the ICAP does not predict for domains and topics that can't be rationalized without logical reasoning, like exceptions to grammar rules. Like there's a lot of exceptions to Korean grammar rules that when I ask a Korean person, they're like, I don't know why, it's just that way. Those kinds of grammar rules. I'm sure every language has something like that, right? That's not something that can be, it's not predictive for that, okay? So what's really important to understand for distinction is intended versus enacted. This is when I was talking about how, although I'm presenting this format in passive, you might be engaging in constructive, okay? And so in ICAP, if I were to create a lecture as part of my series, it's assumed that this is passive mode. But the reason why other people can engage in different ways is because I don't know what's going on in your mind. In your mind, you might be going through cognitive processes. You might be battling me. You might be like, I don't believe that, Jesse. I'm gonna like, you're taking your own body knowledge and comparing, contrasting, or trying to explain things, right? So oftentimes, this is where I would make the argumentation is lectures are not the worst. But lectures are meant for experts. Because if you have people who are somewhat experts, people have good body of knowledge on a particular topic, and if you gather them in a room and someone gives a lecture, oh man, everyone's engaged. And they're gonna ask you really tough questions later because they're fighting with you in their head, right? Or agreeing with you, but they're kind of processing through that cognitively. But we can't tell overtly, right? We talk about overt empirical evidence. We can't. The reason why it's still classified passive, even though I have a room of, let's say, a room full of experts and I do a lecture, it's classified passive because I don't know. There's no way for me to empirically understand that unless maybe I interview them in the future, right? And so, what am I doing on time? What do I need on to? Okay. So, so I'll talk about the study that I did. And I'm not gonna say the university name, but it might be one of my alma maters. Okay. So I created this instructional rubric that classifies everything that we've talked about into categories so that you can rate learning activities and different parts of courses in this ICAP framework. And I can share this later if anyone's interested. Please email me. But you can also look up ProQuest dissertations. This will become a full paper soon. But I'm just going to kind of zoom past that. That's not the important part. Okay. So the question for this study was, does the design of courses for deeper learning teaching strategies lead to improved student outcomes? Is the ICAP instruction rubric a valid instrument for detecting these differences? So one thing to note is that in the study, I used ICAP dosage as in the time students spent in a particular mode of engagement as a proxy for levels of ICAP engagement. So I've never seen a class that's like, although it's possible, usually you don't have classes that are 100% one thing. I guess 100% passive is the most likely, or just only a lecture, right? But usually most teachers will have one or two things that might be active, it might be constructive, interactive. Usually there's a blend of different kinds of activities, right? And so I would say that because of this, I used ICAP dosage with time to kind of rate these kinds of activities as, so that let's say someone did a lecture for 60 minutes, but spent 8 minutes having students turn talk, debate, whatever. Well, it's 8 minutes interactive, let's say, as long as they set up some good collaboration structures, and 52 minutes passive. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview of kind of how these ratings and dosages were created. And so the first step was to rate the learning activity itself, whether it was, for here, it was lectures, homework, lab, recitation. We calculated a dose, and I was working with secondary data, and so what we did was use the syllabus, the course schedule, learning materials to kind of determine the time spent for that activity. And so then we also, let's say like a homework had like half generative problems and half like non-generative problems. Well then, then we'd say it'd be half active, half constructive. And actually with homework, unless they do it collaboratively, that's recitation, there's no real passive or interactive generally, right? And then we estimated that dose. And then so for some of these things, I couldn't like calculate the dose, right? I interviewed the instructors to be like, how long do you think they should spend on this? And that's a lot of noise in the data, right? But even with all this noise that was introduced just by even this procedure, what's astounding is that actually the results will astound you in terms of how much noise exists, yet I was able to detect certain interesting things. And so here's some sample ratings of ICAP in homework problems, let's say. Which of the following is an element? That's an active question or a non-generative question, or a rating, right? Weather balloon of 65 liters is released at 7:45 torr and 25 Celsius. The balloon expands to 835 liters. When the balloon rises to an altitude at 5 Celsius and 0.066 atmospheres, will it have expanded to its maximum volume? Now, a student might have had certain examples that are similar to this, but most likely not exact. So if a student had exactly the same question multiple times in a row with just changed numbers, then that's active. Well, the first time will be constructive, but after that's active. But I would assume that most homework problems don't repeat like that from what I've seen. And so I rated something like this as constructive. And I never individual, it's constructive because it's individual. It was for homework. So next one is rank the 3 types of bond strength. I told you ranking is active. But if you just add in, here's a quick way that as an instructor, you can make this much more complex. Why? Why did you rank it this way, right? And having students explain that, all of a sudden it elevates this into a constructive task. So then here, the next one is also a constructive, but I labeled it as interactive. Which of the samples release the most amount of heat upon cooling from this? Explain your answer, right? That word explain, that verb is there, right? It was rated as interactive because this was for a recitation where students are expected to collaborate in these class sessions together. School context, large public university in the Southwest, 2019 to 2021. And if you notice, that's a very interesting time period. So that's right when COVID-19 hit. And so we had some data before that, during, and after. And I say after, although a lot of people in the East Coast are like, or Northeast are like spring 2021's after. Yeah, like Arizona, like COVID-19 was like 2 weeks and then everything was open. So schools are open for a little bit less, but then you know, things opened up quite fast in this area. Okay, so here are the results. So I took this and I related ICAP dosage with student course grades and final exam scores. And so to kind of interpret this a bit, number one, like the model itself is the p-value was less than 0.001, so it was quite robust in that sense. And actually, in terms of effect size, when we as an explanatory adjustable R squared here, right? And this model explains for about 35% for the final exam and about 70% for course grade. So it's a bit more robust for the final exam than for the course grade. And if you look at these are standardized beta values, you'll see that that passive dose actually did quite well for final exams. There was a positive 0.445. Active dose actually had a negative relationship with the final exam, and constructive and interactive both had a positive relationship with final exam. But you know, these are just beta values and they don't tell the full story. So we'll get to that in a second. And for course grades, it showed something similar. Yeah, actually this one, it showed passive dose was also in the negative, right? So, which I can help explain that in a second. But, and then we also took some demographic factors to help, you know, to wean out the model a little bit to kind of understand what's going on. I'm not going to go as much into the right side of the column, although I think that's really interesting. It can make it a very long conversation. So we'll keep it at the ICAP level for today. So then what I did was I did some mathematical calculations with the beta values to make it relative. So I made it points per hour. So per hour of this dose, you can expect this many points increase. So for example, this is for final exam. So passive dose, students improved about 1.58 points per hour of passive dose, AKA lectures. There were lectures here. Students lost points if they were active dose, and you know, these were like labs. Apparently these labs weren't very good. You know, it depends how they delivered, obviously, but they were mostly step by step, right? And then constructive dose, 1.56, right? It's very similar, pretty much just equivalent to passive dose in terms of students' improvements in their final exam scores, and interactive, 2.62. That's quite a big difference. This doesn't show the full hierarchy, but I think I can explain some of this. So one of the things is that 75% of the exam was non-generative problems, as in recall types of problems, and 25% of the exam questions were generative, as in the types of constructive type of problems we talked about. So if you think about it, then yes, certainly shouldn't passive dose do quite well for those non-generative problems. And this is why we believe that this value is actually positive in the final exam for passive dose, because yeah, for the final exam, which is 75%, I guess, passive type questions, this should be doing quite well there, right? And so I think that's the reason why passive dose is doing well here. Maybe we could have a study if you only make a test with only generative problems, maybe this will also come out negative. I'm not sure. But But that's just one explanation. But I do think it's quite plausible, and we need to do more research on that, obviously. And so for course grades, active dose didn't actually even we found no relationship with the active dose. But passive dose actually for course grade, it was minus 2.26 points per hour of course contact, which actually is it's pretty remarkable. Even if you take that small quarter of a point, there's a lot of hours in the course, right? Same thing with constructive dose 0.54, much higher increase. And then if you look at interactive, it's astounding. 3.32 points per hour of contact of working collaboratively with other students. And when I saw this, I was like, wow, the power of recitation, right? And then this is the power of good homework problems. That's where it mainly came from. Good homework problems. This came from recitation with good homework problems, right? So collaboration. And so I think that's yeah, I think this is pretty astounding. Although just note that course grade, right, again, had a lower R-squared value, and it's because, and it makes sense because course grade encompasses a lot more. There's a lot of other factors to your course grade, such as participation, maybe your clicker grades, and there's a lot of other factors. And so it makes sense that it doesn't explain it as well, but for the portion that it does explain, it's quite significant. Some limitations to the study. It's not an RCT, and you know, most social science we don't do RCT, but it's not even like a really robust quasi-experimental design either. It was secondary data, right? And so, and then also we had COVID-19, and we only had 5 instructors, although there were a total, I think, of 13 sections. So we had some instructors had multiples, and some had actually different types of courses. They might have an async course, a sync course. And one final thing is we did not ascertain the nature of final exam questions, because except for one, but I just said generally we didn't because most instructors were not willing to share, because apparently I think a lot of them repeat the same final exams, right? And or very similar, right? And so they didn't want to share with me. But even just the one that I saw, I was like, that was the one where I said 75%, 25%. And I would assume that there is a little bit of overlap somewhat to say that most exam questions tend to be declarative knowledge, recall knowledge, and not generative and complex thinking as much, right? And that's a lot of times that's because, you know, like we're trying to get a mixed bag of information from our students oftentimes as instructors. So some recommendations. So as you can see, some relatively small changes to course design had a high association with improved student academic outcomes. Although this is very preliminary, we need to do more study, but I've also personally seen this in my own students too. So teachers should improve the quality of the questions asked so that they go beyond memorization, skill practice, and listing. Questions should allow for generation, right? Such as explain yourself, compare and contrast this. And then there's that list from that, the reference will be at the end at the last slide, so you can find that article. If you can't get access to it because it is an encyclopedia, just email me. I'll get it to you. Find ways to allow students to collaborate on these higher quality questions and assignments, right? The recitation. So this has huge implications, especially in the college practice, where, you know, recitation is oftentimes it's kind of not seen as much value. Some instructors probably value quite a bit, but you know, I still see a lot of lectures where that's the main format of learning, right? But to me, you learn by doing. That's my personal kind of mantra. And so I actually like the concept of, let's say, what if you made a little bit more recitation, a little bit less lecture, right? And so, and then we need to make assessments that could detect differences, as in like generative and non-generative learning with inference type questions, right? We call them, when I say generative, also inferential, right? You have to kind of make an inference to understand that question. Yeah, and that's it. This is just an overview of ICAP. Thank you.